New Horizons, British Islam Conference, the whole thrust of the question is, how do we live an authentic Muslim life in the society, in the age, in the context in which we live today? That's what it's all about. That, of course, is not exceptional to Britain today. It's not exceptional to any particular society. It's going all the way down through human history. Now, Fazlur Rahman from 1962 to 1968 was taken to Pakistan by the president and was asked to head up what we can call the central government think tank on how to apply Islam in a way that made sense in a 20th century country that was supposed to be founded on Islamic principles. And so that was the challenge that he was facing there. And you can say that a great deal of his life was concentrated into those 6 years in Pakistan. And some of his most creative writing was done at that time. One of the conclusions that he drew very early was that most of the way that we live our Islam, most of the Sharia, is actually drawn from Hadith. It's not drawn from the Quran itself. And Fazlur Rahman's understanding of the Quran was that this is a book of ethical guidance, it's not a law book. And if it's a book of ethical guidance, then it has to be interpreted in human contexts in order to make it something that can be lived out. So that was his first premise. The second premise was that who and what was Muhammad? Muhammad was that most sublime amongst human beings, one who is called, purified by God, protected from sin by God. Therefore, Muhammad, his way of living out the Quran becomes what Fazlur Rahman calls the normative moral law. In other words, look at the way that he lived, and then you can begin to understand the way that you should live your Islam in the society in which you live. And this plays in very much with the kind of discussion that Michael was raising earlier. Now, Fazlur Rahman held it to be inconceivable that the new generation of Muslims who had converted to become Muslims, as it were, at his feet, did not observe his every action and his every teaching and his every way of doing things. In other words, he calls them disciples, not followers. Disciple being one who molds and models his life upon the example of the teacher. And therefore, he says that any thought that there wasn't something called the prophetic Sunnah, the Sunnah of the Prophet himself, is just childish nonsense. Clearly, this existed, as it were, at the feet of the Prophet himself. Secondly, these people memorized poetry, they memorized their genealogy, they memorized the folklore of their people, they lived by memory. So what child thinks that they didn't memorize also elements of his teaching, elements of his life? So that we have what Fazlur Rahman called the prophetic Sunnah, being the verbal and non-verbal elements of, as it were, the implementation of the Quran in the life of the Prophet, in the context of Mecca and Medina during his lifetime. So he calls that the prophetic Sunnah. Now, we know that very soon after his death, and even in the last few years of his life, Islam was expanding very rapidly to other societies away from Medina. Now, this gives us then a way of implementing the teaching of the Quran and the teaching of the Prophet in very different social contexts. In Iraq, in Medina, coming up into Egypt, and so on. And we know it's a classical standard of the students of fiqh who will tell you that Al-Shafi'i changes his rulings on questions when he moves from Iraq to Egypt. What's going on there? Because what he's doing is reinterpreting, re-understanding that one teaching which is coming from the Prophet and from the Quran in a different social context. And so Fazlur Rahman termed this what he calls the living Sunnah. How does a community live out those two principles of Quran and Sunnah, prophetic Sunnah, in their society at that time. So this living Sunnah becomes just, this is how we do it. Now, if you are a disciple, he said, then the difference between we saw the Prophet do this and this is what we all do because we've all modelled our lives on the Prophet is a very wavy line. That's why if you look at Malik, for example, the Muwatta, you'll see that very often he starts off all his legal rulings by saying something coming from a companion of the Prophet, not from the Prophet himself. So this was a kind of collective sense of this is how we live out our Islam. And then he concludes that section by saying, and this is the Sunnah with us. So this is how we put it into practice. So Fazlur Rahman then begins to develop an understanding of this living Sunnah being shaped and moulded and authenticated by the ijma' of the community. We bear witness that this is how the Prophet, this was handed down to us. And so you've got Quran and prophetic Sunnah as your sources. You've got reasoning, ijtihad, when you're working out how to live in our society, which is different from 7th century Medina. And then you've got the authentication of the ijma'. We have considered this together, and this is the Sunnah with us. First section. Second section. Fazlur Rahman then goes back to look at the Hadith and the study of Hadith, and he sees some of the very problems that Mikhail has already talked about with the life of the Prophet. Why is it that for the first 150 years of Islamic development you find very few Hadith being cited? Hadith that 200 or 300 years later were absolute knockdown answers to the question, well, if they were so well known originally, why weren't they cited? Why didn't people bring in that evidence? And then he saw anachronistic hadith. We have lots of hadith that we call anti-hadith, hadith, as well as pro-hadith, hadith, anti-Sufi, hadith, pro-Sufi, hadith. And then we have questions which were absolutely non-existent in the life of the Prophet being dealt with in hadith. The questions of predeterminism and free will, for example, or political questions like the Kharajites and so on. These things are being dealt with there. So you've got political issues from later on supposedly being dealt with by the Prophet at a completely different time, in a completely different context. And so he said, we've got to go back and relook at this again. Now, I want to give you now a little model. So no pictures, but imagination. We are all very familiar with putting sugar in tea. Okay? So you've got the crystalline sugar, which is solid. You put it into the tea. It's dissolved. It's liquid. You know it's there because you can taste it. But it's now in another form. It's liquid. Other way around. We all know that if you take salty water at the seaside and you leave it out in shallow pans in the hot sun, the water evaporates and the salt crystallizes out, and there's your white salt. So the salt was there in liquid form, and now it's crystallized out into solid form. The key is same substance, two different forms. Now this is the model then that Fazlur Rahman wants us to engage with. And what he says is that the living community developed their understanding of how to live out the way of Islam based on these original sources of Quran and prophetic Sunnah, using their reason, their ijtihad, and then affirmed by their ijma'. And then at the time of Al-Shafi, he sees the period of Al-Shafi in the generation of Hadith, and you know that Al-Shafi changes the whole game. Ijma' is no longer something that we're working on. It's now something that's established in the path, and therefore we don't move from it. So it becomes a fixated, backward-looking thing. Now at this stage, he says, what happens is that the Sunnah, the lives out into Hadith. So it's there in the liquid form of the living Sunnah. It then crystallizes out into Hadith. Same substance, different form. Now, these Hadith then, how do you authenticate them? Instead, earlier you were authenticating the living Sunnah by the Ijma'. Now, what you now have is the development of this whole Hadith process of developing an isnad. So you are going to authenticate it by saying, not this is the Sunnah with us, this is how we as a community live it out. This was the Prophet's teaching. So it was then, this is the Prophet said, and then you develop the idea of an isnad that actually puts together a means of authentication. So he sees this, crucially, he uses terms like formulation and generation. So he says the hadith are formulated, are generated from the living Sunnah. So it's this process of crystallization, as I put it. So you've gone into a series of statements which contain authentic living Sunnah in crystalline form, authenticated by an isnad that goes back to the Prophet. And that, he said, is then, as it were, concretized so that it becomes a kind of straitjacket within which the whole thing has to operate. And that's our problem. And that's the problem that we could, in short form, summarize as saying, if only we would take our society back to 7th century society, we would then be able to live authentic Islam. In other words, you take those hadith as being a straitjacket into which you have to force yourself. Now, Fazlur Rahman's approach to this was to say, we've got to do something radically different. And he said, we've got to take those hadith and treat them as crystals, which we now need to redissolve. And you've got to redissolve them, not into today's society, but back into the society in which they were originally created, or precipitated out, if you like, crystallized out. So you have to take the hadith, bring them back into that society, into that context in which they were originally precipitated, and then you can begin to understand exactly what it was they were trying to do and teach in that society. See, Fazlur Rahman is a deeply believing, pious individual, and he wants to say that the Quran is the word of God. The Prophet is the Prophet who is so filled with divine illumination, with divine knowledge, so that if you go back to your Neoplatonic stuff, the lowest emanation of the divine becomes the form of the prophetic intellect, so that everything he does and says becomes, as it were, the living Quran. Now, if you take that as your model, then you've got to get right back to that, and then you can begin to understand how you're putting them back into that original context. And without that, then you're just going to end up with a distortion. So he would say, the Quran speaks in, the Prophet acts in a particular time and context. But it speaks for, he acts for all times and all contexts. So as time and context changes, that's where our challenge lies. Now, in order to begin then to say, how do we implement that in our time? We have to redissolve the hadith back into the living Sunnah of that period, lift out from it, through mighty intellectual work, this is not a game, we have to lift out from it what it was. What was the elan, is the term he uses. What's the thrust? What's it all about? How is the Prophet is a moral reformer of society. He's not a little legislator for, whether or not the water has to go under your ring when you're making wudu, for goodness sake. He's a model reformer of society. And how do we recapture that thrush that changed society and then apply that into our context today? And that was the challenge that he tries to work through. Now, here comes the little advertisement. If you want to try and get your head around this and think about it. Now, I'm not an advocate here of Fazlur Rahman, but I am an advocate of thinking very seriously about these things, because I spend all my life trying to help young Muslims to understand something about their Islam, and there's a real question to be asked. Why are they coming to a Christian student of Islam to try to understand something more about their Islam? Well, because at least they can understand what I say, and I take their question seriously. Think about it, I take their question seriously, and they're not afraid to come back with further and further questions. But also, and here I think is a real challenge, if we truly believe, as I do, that Islam is guidance for all humankind, this is not the preserve of a little bunch of people who happen to be called Muslims. So how do we unpack this guidance for the benefit not just of Muslims in Britain, but for the benefit of the whole of British society, and therefore, whether Mr. Johnson likes it or not, for the whole of European society? How do we actually begin to bring these impulses into our society in a way that is a positive and active contribution? And that seems to me to be a crucial question. You cannot divorce it from the authentic teaching of the Quran or the Prophet, otherwise it ceases to be Islam. But you certainly do not live in the villages from which some of our grandparents came, or in, those contexts throughout history. There's no point in going back to the 11th or the 9th century or whatever, nor back to the 7th century. You've got to bring that into this time here. So if you go to my website, which is just my name with an org on the end, and you see there's a button called Fazlur Rahman. There are actually 2 little articles there that may be of some assistance in trying to puzzle this stuff out. One is a very short piece, just really designed for today, which is called From the Living Sunnah to Crystallized Hadith and On to Today. And that's where I've tried to bring out those issues which I've talked about today. And then there's a longer, and if I may say so, a rather more complicated article, which is an analysis of his book, Islamic Methodology in History. Now, Fazlur Rahman wrote all this stuff up in a series of articles in the Journal of the Central Institute of Islamic Research, of which he was the director, 62 to 69. And he also produced the core of those articles as a book called Islamic Methodology in History. It's not easy to get hold of a copy. I've got one. And so this is an analysis of it. So that may be or may not be useful if you want to try and get your head around his thinking there. I think he is really grappling with some serious issues. And I just want to end up just touching back to something also that Mikhail was saying. There is a tendency to dismiss the work of very learned, very committed, and very erudite non-Muslim scholars of Islam. And Fazlur Rahman studied under those people. He did his doctorate under Stefan van den Berg and H.A.R. Gibb. He worked in Durham, he worked in McGill with Cantrell Smith, with all sorts of really committed people there. And he jolly well knew that you could not ignore what it was they were saying. And so he draws a distinction between methodology and conclusion. And he says you don't necessarily have to agree with the conclusions. I don't agree with a lot of their conclusions, he said, but I am a serious, educated, scholarly individual, and I have to take seriously the methodology, their writing, what it is that they say. And that is what he tried to do. And it seems to me that that is crucial, because our young people growing up in Britain and in Europe today are being educated to a very advanced level in whatever subjects they're working in, and they are not going to take fairy stories from their religious leaders. And if we cannot work with their real questions and real struggling and real problems, we are going to lose them left, right, and centre. So methodology and conclusions, not necessarily the same thing, but we cannot ignore their methodologies, because they weren't stupid and they worked very hard to master all the material, and they wrote it up for us. Thank you very much.